Hi, I'm Marika Hahn. I'm a Creative Center Hospital Artist in Residence. I teach watercolor painting. I love watercolor painting, and I'm going to show you a few basic techniques. I think you'll have a great time. The most important technique for watercolor painting is something called wet and wet. There's lots of water used for watercolor painting, and I'm going to show you what happens. I'm going to just make a very simple circle. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need a template. When I drop, this is wet now, when I drop a color, I'm not painting, I'm just touching the color and the color will spread. If I go over, now you're seeing it's called bleeding. If I make a circle and I leave a little area dry, I'm going to leave one little area dry. I'm going to touch it with some color. It will not go. You can see how it's not going into the area that's dry. The color will just bleed. So you can really have fun. You just drop some colors in. I'm working on watercolor paper. That's really important. You need a paper that will stand up to the water and won't buckle. I'm going to just take a drop of color, just place it and watch it bleed. That's what it's called. One more time and then I'll show you something else. Another technique that uses interesting brush strokes. So you can fill up a whole page. If you place them close together, the colors will bleed into each other. So now you've had a little demo of wet and wet. I'm going to set this aside to dry. I've started making some brush strokes. I'm using a number 10 watercolor brush. If I press, I can use the brush to create a nice shape. If the colors overlap, just as with the circles, they will bleed into each other. So you can actually get a very nice decorative painting by just using a brush stroke. You can add a little shadow by adding a darker color. So that's using your brush and getting an interesting brush stroke. I started something earlier today. I'll hold this up so you can see this. This is a finished painting. And it took a while, but this is called layering, where you can actually see through the leaves, see through the branches. And the way that you get that is you do some of the painting and you let it dry. It's dry there. Now I'm going to add some more branches going on top of this. This is called layering, creating layers. I will incorporate some wet and wet. I'm going to take, this is a brush stroke now. I'm holding my brush, I'm pressing down, coming up. So now I have a nice brush stroke. Now using wet and wet, I'm going to take a darker color. I'm going to touch it to the light color and it's going to bleed. So now you have layering, you have wet and wet. I'm going to do a leaf on top of the gray. So you can see right through it. I'm leaving a little area dry and I want to show you what happens. I touch it with my brush. The darker color is bleeding and you see through the leaf. Take another color. Oh, let's do this color. I'm going to go over the branch. I'm really using my brush to get this nice shape. Touch it with the color. It's going to bleed. So you can see how relaxing and fun it can be. The whole thing about watercolor painting is don't stress if it doesn't do exactly what you thought it was going to do. Maybe the color is a little too wet, it will bleed. You just kind of have to relax and let it happen. I think I'll throw a little flower over here. I'm just going to use the point of my brush. This is about brush stroke. And push, and push, push, very light, not a lot of pressure. At the very base, I'll touch a darker color. So now I have layering, I have the brush stroke, and I have bleeding going on. These make great cards. You just cut them into the size of an envelope that you happen to have around. Here, I'm just adding some branches. Maybe I have no planning going on in here. I'm just having fun. I teach watercolor, but I love doing it. It is so much fun. I'm working on paper that's 140-pound cold press. You need to have something that will hold the weight. You can see this is very, very wet. I want to show you something called dry brush. So I'm going to put this aside to dry, and I can layer some more leaves on it. These are peaches that I've done, and where the color bleeds, that's wet and wet. I'm going to take a peach, and I'm going to darken it. I'm going to grab a paper towel. It's always good to have a paper towel handy. It's also good to have a little scrap of paper so you can test your color. I'm doing everything with a number 10 brush today. Testing it. Okay, I've got the color I want. Now, because it's called dry brush, I have to make sure my brush doesn't have too much water on it. I've been using a very wet brush. I want to just subtly darken, slightly darken an area. So it's done gradually. I'm going to take most of the water out, blade my brush a little bit. I'm going to give it a little more contrast so that you can see it, but it is subtle. There I go. That's happening now. And then I can get it even drier with my fingertips so that it's gradual. The whole thing with dry brush is it's gradual. When I teach how to make pears, we do a light green pear, and then the blush that goes on top of a pear is kind of a reddish color. You have to do that when the pear is totally dry. I'm going to put a little blush of color right here on the yellow, so I can really control this. I can take, there's a little green spot there. I'm going to add a little dry brush, darker green, drying my brush. I'm going to work on this leaf. Just going to take that dry brush and very gently add a subtle darkening to the color. You can really control how dark or how light you make it. So I did a dry brush on this part of the peach, and I did it to this leaf. I'll add a little darkness using dry brush. When I get the color on my brush, I'm just making sure it's not too wet. I don't want any bleeding here. Besides, the base of it is dry. This is dry brush. So we talked about wet on wet, dry brush, brush stroke, layering, which is also called glazing. I hope you spend some time and practice. Watercolor is all about practicing, relaxing, and experiment. Thank you.